Let me ask you a question. The first time you watched or read Maze Runner, who were you rooting for? Given how the conflict is portrayed throughout the trilogy, it's a pretty easy question to answer. Thomas and his friends, the Gladers. In all three films, we follow Thomas every time he and his companions win. We see it and sympathize. Every time they fail, every time they are betrayed, every time they suffer, we see it and sympathize. Now, contrary to what it might seem like, these movies aren't about growing up or chaos and order or identity or friendship. They are about ethics and morality. There is no good guy or bad guy. There are only opposing ideals rooted in the overarching question of, should we sacrifice the immune to save humanity? Just like the trolley problem, there is no true answer. However, before we get into the nitty-gritty of this analysis, let me give you a little refresher. In the first movie, our main character Thomas wakes up in a lift with no memory and finds himself in the Glade, a large open space surrounded by a massive, ever-changing maze. The Glade is populated by other boys who have created an agrarian-like society to survive. The runners of the group have been trying to solve the maze and escape for years, but deadly creatures called grievers make it dangerous. And even with the whole thing mapped out, they can't figure out how to leave. After proving his worth, Thomas becomes a runner, making important discoveries that later help them escape. He forms close bonds with fellow Gladers, including Minho, the lead runner, Chuck, Newt, and later Teresa, the only girl to ever arrive in the Glade. Together, they discover that they are part of an experiment being conducted by a mysterious organization known as Wicked. But the maze was just the start of many challenges to come. In the second movie, after the protagonists escape the maze, Thomas and his friends believe they've made it out of Wicked's control, but their trials have just begun. They are saved by a group of individuals claiming they are the good guys, but they quickly discover Wicked is behind it all again. After they escape the seemingly evil organization's facility in an attempt to avoid being experimented on, they must traverse the Scorch, a desolate, sun-baked wasteland filled with cranks, humans infected by the flare virus, which turns them into violent, zombie-like creatures. The group must make their way to the safe haven while battling the elements, cranks, and betrayals within their groups. Along the way, Thomas learns more about the flare virus, a pandemic that wiped out much of the world's population, and the organization Wicked has been trying to find a cure. After crossing the Scorch and fending off Wicked, the group, now fewer in numbers, is one step closer to being free. In the final installment, Thomas and his friends face their most dangerous challenges yet. They first try finding Minho, who was abducted for testing by Wicked along with many other immunes, but gaining access to the last city will prove difficult. They meet new freedom fighters who can help them get through the walls, all whilst evading Wicked's grasp. They save many immunes, retrieve Minho, and suffer losses in the process. Though after a great fight and chaos, the virus began reaching global level. No one was safe. In the end, Thomas and the remaining survivors find a safe place, free from Wicked's control, where they can start anew and hope for a future without the flare. This is a film where many important things happen, but I'll break them down later so you aren't confused. Now, this obviously isn't a full, in-depth summary of the trilogy, but it should be a refresher for those who have seen the films and enough of a breakdown for those who haven't. But what is the true conflict of these movies? In the first two movies, much of the perceived conflict is a sort of person against environment story, but the troubles of the environment, specifically the maze, is reinforced by Wicked. In all the films, we effectively live with the Gladers like a fly on the wall, and in this process we are equally as opposed to Wicked as our protagonists. They have caused what appears to be completely unnecessary deaths of teenagers in the name of science, and they are the central cause of Thomas's group's suffering. Wicked maintains a very mysterious aura this entire time. We don't know the complexities of their motives, they really just seem like a ruthless organization. It's only until the latter half of the third film that we begin seeing how this perceived conflict of Wicked equals bad and Thomas and his group equals good is challenged. It's challenged so strongly that I'd argue there really isn't a bad guy in this movie, but we'll get into that later. Let me first tell you what the real conflict is. The flare, the virus that turns people into cranks, is the conflict for everyone. Even the immunes can be killed by the cranks by being ripped apart, so all characters have this mutual enemy, which ultimately is the virus. This eliminates any good guy, bad guy dynamic, because now there are only individual responses to how the flare shall be dealt with. Some want to find a cure by any means necessary, and others don't believe any humans should be harmed and or sacrificed for the greater good. This movie, as mentioned in my introduction, is a battle of ethics. My analysis will be easiest to understand if you imagine the Maze Runner series as the trolley problem on steroids. The trolley problem being a moral dilemma regarding whether or not you should pull a lever, diverting a train towards one person, sacrificing them in order to save 5. Alternatively, you can simply not intervene and allow the 5 to die and the 1 to live. What is the correct answer? If you go on a website like neil.fun and try the absurd trolley problems game, you'll find people are quite divided on this question. The division between action and inaction grows as the stakes increase. By that I mean when the two options appear more like equivalents. Similarly, in Maze Runner, if you really look at the movie through an objective lens of, should we sacrifice a minority to save the majority, determining who the good guys are becomes much more difficult. If you'd pull the lever killing the minority to save the majority, do you feel the same when it comes to the dilemma presented in Maze Runner? Asking a question like this is, in my opinion, quite silly. Our decisions oftentimes aren't so linear. We try to evaluate and weigh the variables at play, seeing what choice is the most right. This justification for rightness, however, can quickly devolve into a self-serving act, which is common. If you were on the track, would you pull the lever, killing yourself to save 5? This question is a lot more difficult because we've added a degree of closeness. The consequences are much more severe than previously. Our life is on the line. But there might be an answer to this ambiguity. Two moral theories, utilitarianism and deontology, are basic answer keys to the way we would go about answering these dilemmas. Deontology, sometimes called Kantian ethics, would argue we should do or not do certain things regardless of the consequences. Basically, the action is what matters, not the outcome. This theory relies on us having some sort of moral parameter for what is good and bad so we can decide right from wrong. Take lying, for example. As a general rule, a deontologist would say we should never lie because lying is bad. So we're using this rule that says lying is bad to determine whether the action itself is right or wrong, regardless of the outcomes. But the utilitarian or consequentialist would counter this and say, well, what if lying can help save someone's life? For example, when a Jew hunter in Nazi Germany asks if you are hiding Jews under the floorboards, should you just tell them the truth? Examples like this make the question a bit harder. Bentham and Mill, popular proponents of utilitarianism, would argue we should do whatever action produces the most pleasure and least pain. As a principle, this sounds great. Just do the thing that results in the best outcome. Easy enough. But as we can see with the trolley problem, sometimes people's lives are at stake, and the best outcome is hard to determine. Given the context of the trilogy, Thomas and everyone who supports him is taking a deontological approach. They are admitting that we shouldn't kill people, full stop, despite any possible benefits. Wicked, on the other hand, is under the belief that we should work to cure the virus and save humanity, no matter the cost. They are the utilitarians. What's interesting, though, is that this movie is very biased, and I'll explain why. As I mentioned earlier with the trolley problem, once closeness is involved, it becomes much more difficult to make the so-called right decision. If it was your mother, father, brother, sister, or best friend, would you still pull the lever? If you were a bit of a utilitarianist before, you're most likely a deontologist now. Thomas, for the audience, is that friend. We don't want to see him die or be tortured. Something about it is just wrong. Deontology just makes more sense in the Maze Runner series. Sacrifice is not the answer, and that's the end of the story. Literally, that is how the story ends. But there's a problem with this. This issue may be exclusive to the films, but I haven't read the book, so I wouldn't know. Here's the problem. The virus is kind of curable. Like, not totally, but kind of curable. It's a little confusing because one former Wicked employee at the end of the Scorch Trials movie says something along the lines of, a synthetic cure can't be made, only harvested from the immunes. And anytime we've seen a cure be used, it sucks. It really just delays the inevitable. So let's talk about the point it all changes. One of Thomas's friends, Brenda, a character he meets in the second film after crossing the Scorch, suffers a bite from a crank. This, as expected, leads to her becoming infected and in desperate need of a cure, or else she will turn. Thanks to the right arm, a doctor is able to retrieve a cure from Thomas's blood. Now, this is where it gets important. After administering the drip IV, Brenda begins healing swiftly and things seem to have worked out. Fast forward to the next movie, and Brenda is still okay. About halfway into the third film, Teresa hears this information and can't believe it. Up until this point, the cure wasn't really a cure at all, it just slowed down the spread of the flare. Thomas's blood, however, destroys the flare, making him truly immune to this brutal infection. The problem with this is that before, finding a cure was practically impossible. Wicked would harvest this temporary immunity from kids, but it wouldn't provide them with any long-term benefit unless they kept injecting themselves with it. This one fact completely changes the moral dilemma, and Thomas even realizes it. I'll preface this section by saying, spoiler alert, when Newt becomes infected and eventually gets killed, Thomas finds out he could have saved him. This means he could have saved Winston and basically anyone he had to watch suffer due to the flare. So even with the fact that the enzymes that fight the virus can't be manufactured, only harvested, this is still sort of weird. I don't know the exact specifications of the virus because the films don't get very deep into it, but the cure is always blue, and is that something other than just their blood or what? I mean, if all you need is blood, Thomas can donate every 50 to 100 days. Aside from the specifications, let's get back to the moral issue. Prior to these revelations being made, the utilitarian outlook on the situation Wicked has is pretty evil. They have no idea if they can even successfully find a cure. It's equivalent to saying pulling the lever on the trolley problem will make the train flip and barrel roll, killing everyone anyways. If they can't find a cure, not only will they sacrifice or torture the immunes, but everyone will die regardless. This is actually where Bentham's philosophic calculus would tell you the choice you are making does not offer the most pleasure, in fact, because of how uncertain it is. But we're not going to get into that. Nonetheless, this view is challenged in the climax of the third film. Dr. Ava Page is humanized and genuinely seems to want to help the world and doesn't want the immunes to feel pain. She literally says, and I quote, "I don't want them to feel any pain." This doesn't absolve her entirely, but it makes the audience realize she is evaluating the efficacy of her decisions and truly trying to identify what the best choice is, and that comes with some pain. And like I said, Thomas realizes this too, and same with Teresa, which was the entire reason for her betrayal. If a cure actually can be made, or at least distributed to a lot of people, Thomas, because he is the only one with what seems to be true immunity, is the only one who has to suffer. I hate to say it, but it is time to sacrifice yourself for the greater good. What's the right decision? All of humanity, or a guy who is good at running? I'm simplifying a lot, but you get the idea. Here's one thing I do know. Jansen is the bad guy. I know I said there's no bad guy in this movie, but this dude does not give a shit about finding a cure. He's so stuck up that he couldn't catch Thomas that he was just like, okay, I'm gonna kill him now. I was trying to decide whether or not this extra nuance makes the films better or worse, because at the start of the trilogy, we had this corrupt organization who just wanted to use people as a mere means, that was exercising their power in the most sinister of ways. But at the end, their goal seems more fair, at least a little bit more fair. That could possibly be the moral of the story. Even the bad guys have a reason for what they are doing. Here are a couple more things about the movie I don't understand. Why did the freedom fighter people Thomas meets destroy the entire city? I thought it was going to be a let's take back what is ours moment, but it ends up being let's just blow everything up because explosions in movies look cool. The last city was so advanced and secure that they should have done some stealth attack, liberated the city, and gotten fair treatment. To me, blowing up the city seemed excessive. And finally, this could partly be because of my incompetence. But are people other than Thomas actually immune? Newt wasn't immune, Winston wasn't immune, and apparently the Griever's infection is a strand of the flare virus, and basically everyone who got it wasn't immune. In the maze, like what the heck? Mino was always said to be immune, but when they used his blood for a cure, it made the subject worse. Now, maybe I'm stupid, but I think that is a bit strange, that multiple of the main characters whose whole shtick was that they were immune just isn't true. Yeah, you need a control group doing a study, but this seems suspicious. That's the whole video. You don't have to like or subscribe, but that's just what I was thinking. See you later. Did you like the video? It was reverse psychology, so you probably will like the video now.